Ori, welcome to the RevAmp podcast. We are absolutely delighted to have you on board here today. And for those people at home who don't have the pleasure of already knowing you, perhaps you can start with just sharing a little bit about yourself, who you are, your role, and a little bit about OwnBackup.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Gideon. It's a pleasure to be here. A little about myself. I actually grew up in the Boston area, started my career in venture capital with a firm called OpenView Partners, where I spent years working with early stage technology companies, helping them build scalable go-to-market teams and helping them with go-to-market strategy. Eventually, I ended up moving to Israel. My wife is Israeli, so she decided we were moving here from Boston, and that was about 7 years ago now. So I've been here since then. Shortly after I moved here, I joined OwnBackup as part of the founding team, and OwnBackup is actually today the leader in SaaS data protection. Mm-hmm. A lot of people ask me what that is, aren't really sure what that is. We really started off in SaaS backup and recovery, and focused specifically on backup and recovery for Salesforce. And that's sort of a newish problem. For many years, companies were using Salesforce and other SaaS applications, not even realizing they had a responsibility to back up and protect that data, in addition to what Salesforce and other SaaS providers provide as part of the service. And so that was one of our big challenges as we scaled, was figuring out how to educate that market. And certainly putting the buyer at the center of our sales process was a huge part of making that happen successfully. We started off just a handful of people today. OwnBackup is a global company, over 550 employees, with offices in Tel Aviv, London, New Jersey, Paris, and Sydney, and also in India.
Very cool. So I've seen you guys, of course, from the sidelines and seen your continued growth as a company, which has been fantastic to watch. And more specifically, what role do you sit in right now at OwnBackup? Because I think that's really the crux of why you're here as a guest. Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So I'm the CRO at OwnBackup, and I lead our entire global sales organization, which includes the direct sales team, solution engineering, channels, our alliances teams, our SDR team, as well as our demand generation and sales ops functions. So it's really a broad scope of, new customer acquisition, driving cross-sell and upsell, as well as pipeline generation. So it's a good sort of broad scope across the funnel and sort of how we think about our customers and how our customers buy software, particularly SaaS data protection.
That's fantastic. And actually, I thought of a good segue here, because I remember when we were speaking prior, before starting at OwnBackup and making Aliyah to move over here, you had a little bit of time out. I think it's not obvious maybe from your LinkedIn profile, but you set some time aside to travel, right? And that ended up with you being on a boat in the middle of the Pacific. What inspired you to take that decision? What happened there?
So I had always wanted to travel, and I'd always wanted to do a sort of a long sailing trip. I growing up in Boston. It's sort of a maritime city in the U.S., so did a lot of sailing while I was there. And when we sort of started thinking about packing our bags and moving to Israel, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to just take some time off and go travel. So we thought, what better way to travel than by boat, and ended up meeting a captain who was sailing a 40-foot catamaran from the UK to Bali. So we met him in the Caribbean, went through the Panama Canal, and crossed all the way to Tahiti. So it was a really great, fulfilling journey. Definitely checked one off the bucket list there.
Fantastic. Yeah. And I think that's the segue there, is on the theme of journey, which is the pickup point right here. Today we're going to have a look at how to create a fluid B2B buyer journey. So from one personal journey now to another. So yeah, just want to really lean into your experience over these last 5-6 years at OwnBackup of really, I imagine over that time your B2B buyer journey has become maybe more sophisticated. It's probably not what it was on day one. So maybe from kind of your leadership perspective, let's start off with your standards maybe of what does good look like in terms of B2B buyer journey. So maybe a little bit of your values and your vision, and then move on from there into how you really measure and validate that. So yeah, in a B2B journey, what does good look like from your perspective?
Yeah. So we've been talking about how to build a B2B buyer journey. The reality is you don't build a B2B buyer journey, right?
Okay.
The customer has a buyer journey. They have the journey that they go through when they go and buy software. It's our job as software sales leaders and software sales professionals to create a B2B sales process that maps to the buyer's journey in a way that positions our technology. And I would say actually more importantly than in a way that positions our technology, in a way that actually helps the customer understand the problem they're trying to solve, and in a way that helps the customer solve the problem. And those are really two different things. And this was something I learned very early on at OpenView, because it's something I spent a great deal of time doing with our portfolio companies, was helping them understand their buyers better. Many cases at early stage tech companies, and even at bigger tech companies, you have people that are constantly changing at the company, and people whose roles are changing. So if you take an early stage company, for example, typically the company starts off selling with kind of founder-led sales or CEO-led sales.
Right.
And usually the founder or the CEO are somebody who understands the problem really well, and they understand the buyer really well, and they understand the nuances. And when they're asking questions, when they're on the phone with the buyer, they understand the nuances of the responses they're getting. And they know what's important to that buyer. They really understand it. And as the company grows, you start to bring in, professional sales folks and professional sales leaders who might be very good at selling in general, but may not understand the specific buyer for the company that they're working for now. And this isn't just an early stage problem, because this happens as the company grows. The bigger the company gets, the more layers of management you get. And the VP of sales that you may have brought in when you had 50 employees now has 2 or 3 layers of management under him or her. And those people may have been brought in from the outside. They may have been promoted from within, but they may have been brought in from the outside. And those people also may not have a good understanding of the buyer. Now, hopefully by that point, you have really good sales enablement, and you have really good sales training, and you have really well-defined buyer personas and really well-defined buying process or sales process, I should say, that maps to your buyer's journey. And all that stuff can help keep the buyer's journey at the center of your sales process. But you have to sort of think about that. And I think one of the earliest mistakes that companies make at many different stages is forgetting about the buyer when they're designing their sales process. They try maybe too hard to optimize for, what they think is going to work best for them, and not think about what is going to work for the buyer and what is going to make the buyer's life easier, and what is going to help the buyer understand their problem better, and what is going to help the buyer make a better decision. And all of those things are super important as you scale a company, especially if you want to keep your win rates high and you want to keep your economics good and your business efficient.
So sometimes I purchase, right? But I'm going to play this out here. Often I purchase, in fact, just from my role within marketing. And the biggest, setback for me as a buyer is the sales rep that I'm speaking to is their quarterly target or their end of queue. So these kind of hard fixed variables, either they have a quarterly target they want to meet, or they have an end of queue and they are whatever percent and they're trying to get across the finish line. These are the two biggest obstacles that I have to overcome, because then it's not about me anymore. It's not about kind of a value exchange. It's not about whatever else. It's literally about, you know, binary numbers and transactional selling of discounting and pressure selling and all the rest of it. And it's really manufactured. It's not authentic. It's not value driven. And perhaps that sales rep, given that there is so much sales rep turnover these days, is not even an expert in their domain. So they're trying to transactionally push me through a process, but not help me really solve a problem per se, apart from the one that's maybe on the script. I say that because I think that's a clash of, I don't know what the word is there, aims. I have one aim, they have a different aim, and time is the X variable.
Yeah.
So as a CRO, how do you acknowledge your buyer and the need for authenticity and to create value, but also, you know, do justice to your role, which is also to reach certain targets in certain timeframes?
Yeah. It's a really good question. And I think, you know, to your point, as long as there are quarterly targets and quotas, you're going to see some of that behavior. But frankly, I understand. I'm a buyer too, and I experience the same things. So I understand completely the dissonance there, and we really do try to ensure that the buyer's interests are coming first. And that's really important to stay authentic and to make sure that your interests are aligned. And frankly, I think buyers these days have learned to take advantage of the sort of end of quarter rush to get extra discounts and stuff like that. And frankly, we try to avoid that too. But let's put that aside for a second.
Right.
I think that the way to acknowledge that and to keep it authentic and to keep the interests aligned, because they really should be. Right. I really think the best salespeople are the ones who are being authentic and actually trying to help the customer solve a problem, not just cram product down their throat. It is to actually do just what we've been talking about, is keeping the buyer's journey at the center of the process. And so let me give some examples of how we do that and how we've done that at OwnBackup over the years. So early on, and our buyer's journey, our sales process has evolved, but early on, our product was, you know, very new. This was a really new category, and most people didn't realize they had to back up their Salesforce data.
Right.
They just didn't. Even today, many people still don't realize it. But Salesforce, like all SaaS applications, have this thing called the shared responsibility model, where they provide an application that's hosted in the cloud. And they do backups of their environments and real-time replication and security and redundancy and all that stuff. But the customer owns the data, and the application has a bunch of buttons. One of those buttons is a delete button. And if the customer pushes the delete button, they expect that data to be deleted. Right? Now, does Salesforce and do other SaaS applications back up? Yes, but they back up for their purposes, not the customer's purposes. And so recovering, you know, 1 or 10 or 10,000 records from Salesforce's backups is not something that's easy to do, and it's not something that's offered as part of the service.
Right.
And so it's really a measure of last resort, and that's true for Salesforce, and that's true for other SaaS applications too. What the vendors provide out of the box is different for each SaaS application. So if you look at Dynamics or ServiceNow or Workday, you know, what they put in there in terms of what they give you out of the box is all slightly different, but they all have the same fundamental shared responsibility model, which is you, the customer, have a responsibility. You have to also keep backups of your own data in case you intentionally or accidentally delete a bunch of data and you want to recover that data.
Right.
So our first challenge early on was actually just helping educate the market, helping buyers understand that they had a problem. And so this was a lot. I mean, now I'm talking about a lot of this was what we did in marketing. And a lot of this was kind of community engagement and getting involved with the Salesforce user groups and Salesforce ecosystems and talking to the MVPs who are in the weeds and who actually get this stuff, who maybe actually have deleted some data and had to call Salesforce support and figure out, how am I going to get this data back now, and realize that actually it was their responsibility to do it. So a lot of that was stuff we did on the marketing side, was about educating the market about the problem. It was about, hey, Mr. CIO, Mr. Salesforce architect, or Mr. head of Salesforce platforms, like, you actually have this problem. We want to bring this to your attention because you may not be aware, because it's not something that Salesforce or ServiceNow or any other apps, go out and talk about very often. It's not like they're shouting, hey, make sure you back up your data because we don't do it for you. So somebody had to do that. And so part of our buyer's journey early on, or our sales process, was in qualifying a prospect, was actually trying to gauge their understanding of the problem. Like, before we can even talk about OwnBackup, before we can even sell you a product, what we want to understand is how are you using Salesforce? Okay, is it something that you just started with, and you're a small company and you're just managing leads and things like that, which may be super critical or may not be, or is it something where you've been running on this platform for 5 years and it's the center of your business and all your critical business is there? So first we want to understand that to help the customer sort of quantify or put a value on the data that they're storing in Salesforce. The second thing we want to do is explain to them what they actually get out of the box. Like, what is your responsibility? What does Salesforce give you? And help them really understand their risk and let them decide, right? I'm not trying to cram software down someone's throat. I'm trying to first just explain to them, you run perhaps a significant, perhaps an insignificant part of your business on this platform. You have a responsibility to protect that data. Here's what it would look like if you lost that data and you didn't have our solution. And, and then if that doesn't sound good to you, then let's talk about what your potential solutions are. And then, we even go so far early on as to explain to them what the potential alternatives are, not just OwnBackup. We actually educate our prospects on, well, you can, back up exports of your data and store them in CSV files. You can do some other options. You have sandboxes. And then we would show them also a demo of our technology. Now, at the end of the day, the buyer still has risk in this decision. At the end of the day, you're talking to, in some cases, let's say a director of IT or a VP of IT, or maybe somebody lower than that in the organization. They're going to have to go to their boss and explain to them that they just realized that they've been running Salesforce for a couple of years and they're storing all this critical data, and they have to actually back that data up because Salesforce doesn't do it for them. That creates a lot of anxiety. Buyers don't necessarily want to do that. So if you think about the buyer's journey for our product, for OwnBackup, the journey starts with first realizing that this is my responsibility and I have to back it up. Second, understanding what my options are to protect it. Third, communicating to my leadership or whoever the decision maker is that this is a thing and we just realized it, and now we have to actually and now I, the buyer, am recommending that we spend money on this. And then OwnBackup, or deciding which vendor is the right vendor to choose, whether it's OwnBackup or someone else. And so then the question becomes, when you get to that stage in the process, is how do we, the sellers, OwnBackup, make that decision as low risk as possible? How do we take all the risk out of that decision? And the way we
you tickle me every time you say that, because obviously I come from marketing, and I'm always thinking that the risk of not taking that decision is equal or greater than the risk to do it. And I feel like I keep on saying that every time you make that sentence, and I'm sure you're aware of that too, right? Like if they don't do it, that risk is greater than if they do. And I'm sure there's almost even an ROI calculator that the more data that they have, the greater the return on that investment is. Like, because that data takes you so much time, and maybe it's not so easy to gather it. And what would you do without it? But keep going. I cut you off, but you just set me thinking that.
Well, that's absolutely right. But that's actually in the first part of what I talked about, which is realizing that you want to invest in the solution. But even once you realize invest in the solution, there's still risk in your decision. Like, which solution are you going to choose? How do you you've now realized you need to spend money on something you had no idea you needed to spend money on.
Right.
How do you make sure you're choosing the right thing? What's the right level? And that's where we introduced the concept early on of a proof of concept. Mm-hmm. It's not revolutionary. Lots of companies do proofs of concept, right. But we really tried to do it, make it hands-on, and work with the prospect and kind of work with them hand in hand, and starting with defining what does success look like. Mm-hmm. In the event of a data loss, what would you want to be able to do? And not just in the event of a data loss, but like early on, we started talking about your data and how you're using Salesforce and what kind of data lives in there. Let's say they're using DealHub IO for their CPQ, mm-hmm. and there's a bunch of CPQ data that lives in Salesforce, and that's really important to them. They could tell us, or we could come to the conclusion together, like, let's just say, for example, all of your price books and SKUs got deleted. How would that impact your business? Okay, let's actually test that scenario. So we would then, set up a sandbox with all their CPQ data or whatever critical data they want to test, back it up, delete the data, and then go through the recovery process with OwnBackup. And then along the way, we look at, some other features, and we talk about what's your recovery time objective? Like how fast do you need to be able to get this back? And can we meet? What is your recovery point objective? How far back do you want to be able to recover? Because sometimes you didn't delete all your CPQ data, but somebody along the way, a Salesforce admin or a CPQ analyst changed, the approval threshold, or changed the price of this product from $1 to $2, mm-hmm. but they did it a month ago. So you have to be able to restore not just the data from yesterday, but you have to be able to restore the data from a month ago and everything that got changed along the way. Right. So that's another scenario we might test. And so we try to take them through all different scenarios to make it super easy for them to say, yes, this offering checks all the boxes, or no, it doesn't. And we try to make that as easy as possible for them. So by the time we get to that end of that POC, they're in their buyer's journey, they've understood that they have responsibility. They've quantified the value of their data. They've quantified the value of losing that data and acknowledged the fact that it's worth spending money on a solution. Mm-hmm. They've evaluated a solution to ensure that it actually can meet their requirements. Mm-hmm. And now they're armed with really everything they need to make that financial decision. And that's exactly how we've aligned our sales process, is basically step by step, understanding that really is the buyer's journey. Our process and our account executives are armed to go through it in that way. And by the way, not all buyers move at the same pace. So sometimes you have to spend more time talking to the buyer about the problem. Sometimes you have to spend more time talking about what a customer can get out of the box. And by the way, we're using the term buyer like it's a single person, when we know that it's always more than one person. Yeah. And the bigger the company is that you're selling to, the more people are involved. Right. And so we also know that in our sales process, that this is sort of not just a linear cycle, but almost a loop that repeats itself at multiple stages throughout the process, mm-hmm. where even when you've gotten through the part where they've acknowledged they have a problem, they've quantified the value of their data and acknowledged that they probably need to spend money to solve this problem. New person gets introduced to the buying process.
Right.
We have to repeat that process with that person, because a lot of times what happens is you're working with the Salesforce team and they're like, holy crap, we need to solve this problem. And then somebody from the infrastructure team comes in and says, wait a minute, why are we backing up Salesforce?
Mm-hmm.
And so you really have to go through that. And so that, I think that applies to many businesses, not just our business, but it's really about thinking about how the buyer thinks about this problem, how they go about buying this problem, and trying to make it as low risk and easy for them as possible to make a decision.
You actually mentioned or led it right away into one potential friction point, which is buyer committee members entering at a later stage. But generally speaking, if we zoom out, what are the potential friction points that would work against you guys creating a fluid B2B buyer journey? Fluid being kind of seamless and smooth, so the opposite of that being friction that could happen along the way that you want to kind of overcome and iron that out. Are there any kind of key friction points that need to be overcome, despite the fact that you have a pretty good kind of rollout model from the discovery, the demo and discovery into the POC and such and such? Is it still possible for it to have friction even after all of that, or after that the checkbooks are open and it's just a case of how much coffee you want to drink between now and then?
Yeah, I mean, there's always friction points. I mean, there's friction around. Depending on the company. I mean, I have to say that at this point, we're at this point where we are, at least in backup and recovery for Salesforce. Mm-hmm. I think we've established a good brand, and we've done enough. We've really evangelized the problem, and I think we can call ourselves the leader in this category.
Right.
And so there is a lot less friction than there used to be. There used to be a lot of friction just around convincing people that they need to back up Salesforce. You always have some friction around pricing.
When I think about friction, I'm not always thinking about external friction, i.e., your company to the customer. Sometimes internal friction, like I don't know, like a bottleneck end of queue with margin approvals or legal ops to kind of process all of the contract management. Like internal friction is as important than external friction in terms of process management, which is a big part of the CRO function. So that's really where I was going with that. Yeah,
absolutely. So the two biggest friction points there were, and I think are for a lot of companies, around information security reviews and legal. So OwnBackup sells to actually the world's biggest companies. I mean, okay. About 50% of our customers have over 1,000 employees. And it skews towards upper thousands of employees in terms of numbers. So we work with a lot of big companies that have a lot of really critical data, a lot of regulation, big legal teams, big compliance teams, a lot of security requirements. And so for us, fortunately, I mean, we take our work extremely seriously. And one of the most important things when it comes to backup is security. And so early on, regardless of the fact that this is a friction point, we invested a lot in security. And I think early on as a startup, what happens is you invest a lot in something like security, but you don't always invest a lot in writing all the documentation and creating the processes and the policies. So we had to spend a lot of work on that type of stuff to ensure that we're able to provide the information in the form that the customers want to receive it in, and make sure that we go through all of our audits. And so today we actually have a very robust security program here at OwnBackup that covers almost all of our information systems, especially anything involving our software development and customer data. But I think that the problem is even more particularly acute for us because we are storing a lot of customer data. Most software solutions don't actually host customer data, or if they do, it's only a very small slice of customer data. Like perhaps for DealHub, maybe it's just the pricing data, which might be sensitive, but it's just the pricing data. We are actually taking all of the data that customer stores in Salesforce. So if you think about what that could be, it's all their customers, it's PII. In the healthcare industry, it's PHI. In life sciences, it could also be other types of intellectual property that those companies consider crown jewels, super critical data. Right. And we're backing up all of that. So we have to be really way ahead of our game. And so today we have almost every security audit and compliance you could get as a software company is something that we've either done or are in the process of going through. And we've also done a lot of work in terms of how we deliver that information, whether it's videos, pre-filled standard forms like C-Star and CSA and I forget what the other one's called, but there's a number of different standardized security review forms out there.
Very cool. So now, if we were to kind of summarize that journey, your journey, as we think about the buyer journey there, what's the kind of key learning or takeaway that you would give back from these last 5 years in terms of perhaps you might do it differently, how you might do it better, or at least how you would prioritize the building blocks of the journey, just kind of in the most simple, high-level view of that possible. What's the key kind of takeaway learning as you look back?
Yeah, I mean, I think we did a lot of things right. I'm not sure there's a ton I would do differently, but you know, I think the key takeaway for the listeners is to always put your buyer at the center of your process. Design your sales process around how your buyer buys software. Take the time to really understand your buyer personas. And when you're creating sales enablement, and when you're creating a process, particularly enablement for your frontline managers too, make sure that they really understand the buyer's journey. Make sure that they really understand the buyer personas. If they don't understand that stuff, that is not going to come across on the phone. It's not going to come across in meetings between your sales team and your buyers. So, you know, making sure that your process and your training are all designed around the buyer and how they buy software, I think is the number one takeaway.
That's a solid takeaway. So yeah, I really, I just repeated that back in my head a few times there, and I was just saying to myself, okay, so in order to understand your buyer, you need to know your buyer. So let's start with, do we know our buyer firsthand? Do we actually speak to them, or do we just learn about them? And I can definitely understand why that's profoundly important. Were you going to say something else there, Ori? I cut you off.
Well, I was just going to say it might seem obvious or perhaps not that insightful, but to your point, I think a lot of companies sort of skim over it and don't go deep enough and don't fully appreciate what it means to do this right. Yeah.
I think there's a difference between reading it in a PDF or a doc versus hearing them speak.
Yes.
A massive difference right there, just straight out the gates. Yeah. Great, fantastic. Well, the good news is, I mean, we're running out of time here, but thank you for myself and all of the team over here with the RevAmp podcast. And the good news is that you guys aren't done. You're going to continue to grow, and we can continue to watch you evolve and succeed. You know, with high expectations. And I think for anybody that's been listening at home who had maybe further questions for you, they can always connect with you via your LinkedIn profile. We'll link to that with this podcast. And I really appreciate you taking the time to give back to us. We really appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll say we're happy to hear from the audience. We're hiring in all roles and in all functions, and so definitely continuing to grow and doing big things over here.
Fantastic, Ori. Well, wishing you guys tons of success. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Gideon. My pleasure.